Good evening, everyone. It's really my pleasure tonight to be able to introduce to you someone that I've heard about for 40 years and finally was able to meet a couple days ago. Alison Owings is a friend of a friend, and we also share a background in television journalism. After getting a degree in journalism at American University in Washington, D.C., Alison Owings headed to television news, working first for the ABC Bureau in Washington, then as a producer at the NBC outlet WRC, before being transferred to WNBC in New York as a writer and field producer. From there, she went to CBS News, the pinnacle of professional television news writing. It was gratifying, if at times terrifying. For example, writing a breaking story for Walter Cronkite while they were already on the air. Despite the honor of this pinnacle, she felt like a cog in the news wheel and decided to leave. Her hope and her plan was to write, quote, that which would not get written if I were not there to do it. She went to live in then affordable southern Spain and wrote an appropriately unpublished novel, which I'm sure many of us have done. While there in the late 1970s, amid an expatriate colony of elderly German women, whose language Alison spoke fluently, if inexpertly, she says, a seed was planted. She realized that these women were unquestioned witnesses of the Third Reich. Very fast forward, and she published Frauen, German Women Recalled the Third Reich. And this was named by the New York Times as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. High praise indeed. Realizing that her writing interests centered on challenging assumptions about people who are stereotyped and or overlooked, her next book was Hey Waitress, the USA from the Other Side of the Tray. After that, and most recently, she published Indian Voices, Listening to Native Americans. All three remain in print, and her archives were purchased by prestigious research institutions. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University, and the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. The books led to speaking engagements at about 50 universities and Holocaust centers, plus her being an honoree at various literary and tribal festivals, and as an interviewee herself by countless media outlets. Meanwhile, she's received invitations to attend several writing residencies, Ragdale, Djerassi, Craigerden. And in 2018, she was awarded the Mayborn Biography Fellowship Prize for a nonfiction work in progress. She's currently working on a book about a homeless man who turned his life around and is now helping other homeless people. She's a member of the Authors Guild, as well as a member of a 200 plus member, mostly online women writers group, among other organizations. She and her husband, Jonathan, live in San Francisco. Alison Owings.
This is a day, in my opinion, that should not have cause to exist, Holocaust Remembrance Day. I ask myself, as I think many of us do, what could I have done to stop the Nazis? Not militarily, but on the home front. And what could so-called good Germans have done? Why weren't there more of them? How could people live with themselves then or later? So thinking those things, I began this book. This is one of the British editions in the 1980s to interview these women who had been, in my opinion, unquestioned. And I must admit that I began the project naively and thinking with sort of a feminist bent that maybe the women were better than the men, and I say better than the men. And I wondered how many of them had been rescuers, how many of them just didn't like Hitler from the start or the Nazis from the start. Well, I was wrong. Immediately, I found out that the range of the women, what they did and what they think about it now, is much wider than I had realized. So my quest became to find the widest sampling of the women as I could. And I wanted them all to have been of age when the Nazis came to power, at least old enough, not infants, but old enough to make some decisions and to have some significant memories. So I'm going to be introducing some of the women in this wide range of women that I interviewed by photographs that I have. I don't have photographs of some of the women I loathed, some of the worst anti-Semites I could have imagined, because I didn't want to see their faces again ever. Instead, I was interested a little more about the women who were less rigorously pro-Nazi, but more what they would maybe call in the middle, because these women reminded me to some extent of American women, and women who made decisions then and now and live with these decisions, and women who maybe have prejudice or fear or have remarkable bravery. And some of the women may remind some of you of people you know, for worse or for better. And it brings up the question to me, at what point do we who are not pro-Nazi, what do we speak, when do we speak up? And at what cost, whether known or unknown, if we disagree in the first place with what we speak up against. So I'm going to show you the stories, the photos, and then tell you some of the stories about the women. And then I'm going to come back and offer a few thoughts. And Rabbi Singer said you might also have some questions, and that would be fine too. So this is the woman who made me change my entire book. Her name is Frau Margaret Fischer. And I was hoping, of course, that she would say something anti-Nazi immediately. And she said just the opposite. She's from Bremen in northern Germany. I interviewed her at her home in Hamburg. And she became an early supporter of the Nazis when she was about 16. I'm just going to read a brief thing that she said. She was influenced by a teacher who was a woman. Her parents were divorced, so she had no men really in her family, if that made a difference. But she said that this wonderful teacher embodied the ideals of National Socialism in such a way, I'd still say, if National Socialism really had been how this woman believed it and embodied it, something completely different would have come out of it. And she showed us the best sides, the idealistic sides of National Socialism, and that convinced me. So she became a kindergarten teacher, Margaret Fischer, and became very enthusiastic about everything to do with the Nazis. And then on my third interview with her, which was in I'm trying to think, in the late 80s, I did this book in the late 80s. And our third interview, she said, oh, by the way, I have a picture of me with Hitler. Would you like to see it? And I was stunned, and she showed it to me. And here it is. This is the woman on the left with a kerchief. That's Margaret Fischer. The year was 1935, and she was vacationing with her mother near Berchtesgaden in southern Germany. Heard Hitler was around and asked and immediately wanted to go see him. Her mother was not a Hitler fan and didn't want to go. And she said, she asked him, why don't you come up to Bremen? And he said, oh, I don't go over well up there, so I'm not going. But this photograph was taken by Hitler's official photographer. It says on the back, H. Hoffmann, and that's Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer. And he stamped it on the back, and she gave me this copy, the original, which I brought back to the United States and had copied because I couldn't do it in Hamburg. So she trusted me with it. Anyway, she then married a man who became a very well-known dissident among historians in Germany. He had the audacity to say he thought maybe Germany was at fault for starting the First World War. And he was drafted, and when he would come home on leave, she said they argued a lot because he said, I don't know what this war is all about. We're going to lose it. And she could have denounced him for treason for saying such a thing, even in the intimacy of the bedroom, but she didn't, and stayed with him. And when the war finally was over, she said she's never felt such a disappointment when she found out what was going on in the concentration camps. She said that remained a cleft in her life that she has never recovered from. And in her opinion, of course, her beloved teacher should have been in charge. Everything would have been wonderful. But she was so disappointed with how things turned out, and she herself blames everyone but herself. So let me go to an entirely different person. This is Frau Wilhelmina Haferkamp, holding her 10th child. And she is very much of from a blue-collar family. Her husband worked for the railroad. She kept having one child after the other, after the other, after the other. And her husband, being a government employee, joined the Nazi Party. And she said it helped a lot because we got a lot more rations, we got a lot more food, we got money for the children. You couldn't really do anything unless you were in the party. However, she hated to see what was going on with people who were essentially slave laborers outside her window. She snuck them soup and told the guard, oh, come on, just turn the other way. And these poor people need something to eat. Her husband, the Nazi Party member, got in trouble and was told to punish his wife and make her stop doing it, and she wouldn't. And she said he was given some celebratory cigars for something or another that she was supposed to give to her father, and instead she threw them out the window to some of the people going by in a line, some more slave laborers, because she knew that they could sell them for some food. And her opinion was that everybody knew everything that was going on. She said she was just too busy to do too much more, but she refused to stop helping as many people as she could. And she also said her husband very well knew that people were being euthanized who had mental problems. Whoops. This woman on the left is named, it's a pseudonym, Verena Groth is the pseudonym. She's with her boyfriend who was killed in the war in 1945. I interviewed her in Bavaria where she lives, and this is a picture of them on some holiday. As she said, a dirndl never goes out of style. And she said that she always felt a bit like an outsider. And then halfway through the interview, she disclosed that she's half Jewish, which I didn't know at all going into it. And what happened is that she herself did not know she was Jewish, nominally Jewish, or she was nominally Protestant because her family had converted generations ago. Her father, Herr Dr. Goldman, was a throat and jaw surgeon, and his parents had converted, and he was just a regular Lutheran, and she didn't know anything different until she said her Jewish grandmother came to her and said, you know, there's one thing that you're going to need to know pretty soon, and she said your father can't bring himself to tell you, but we're part Jewish, and and this man Hitler is going to come to power. This was in 1932. And I think that things are not going to be good for us. But you should know this, and your father is not able to is not able to tell you this because he's too upset about it. And she was around 10 at that time. And she said when she got the news, she said she just stood and looked at some children playing, and she said, "Now my childhood is over." Then later, she said that she did not have to, she did not have to wear a star because the family had converted earlier. But her father immediately lost his job as a surgeon, and she had trouble getting any kind of schooling. And she was very upset about being left out of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the BDM, the Hitler Youth for Girls organization, because she just wanted to belong. And they said, well, we're really sorry, but you're Jewish, so you can't be. And she didn't, as I said, hadn't even known she was Jewish. So they had a rough life during the war, she and her father. Her mother, she said they did not have her parents did not have a good marriage, but they knew that would have been disastrous if they divorced. Her father would have been on his own because her mother as well was nominally Aryan, so to speak. And this is Trautgräber, sorry, that's her real name, Trautgräber, Verena Groth, later in life. She was a big woman. She big-footed, big laugh. She smoked cigars. No, she smoked a pipe, excuse me. She became a landscape architect because her father said, I want you to get a job that will make you happy when you're old. And she did. And she told me that she is so concerned about anti-Semitism in Bavaria, near where she is, that her neighbors do not know of her Jewish heritage. And but she told me, but that's why she has a pseudonym. This is a piece of work. Frau Maria von Lingen was the most nervous woman I have ever met. Very snobby. She became a countess when she married a count who had a castle in Silesia with a suit of armor in the entry hall, that kind of situation. And she said she just couldn't stand Hitler and these little Philistines who were just screaming all over the place like they didn't have anything else to do. And she was such a snob that she also said she did not even like the color brown that they chose for their uniform. She was completely snobbish, and yet there are weird things about her. She had a lot of childhood tragedy, including her very emotionally unstable mother killing herself by swallowing muriatic acid that led to a long, prolonged illness and death. And then, of course, when the Russians came, they all had to leave. They fled Silesia, and she fled to the West and lived in Überlingen, which is in southern Germany. And in her later life, she looks quite different. She really liked riding a motorcycle, and she had lots of lovers. And she was sort of so snobby that she didn't like anyone who was really not royal one way or the other. But then, to my surprise, and I wouldn't call her exactly anti-Semitic, but she was very much caught up in herself more than anybody else, I'd say. But late in life, she realized that this little town of Überlingen had a concentration camp in it, and she didn't know it. And she said, well, all these other cities had concentration camps, and major or minor, and they have monuments. Why doesn't Überlingen? She got in touch with Yad Vashem and managed somehow through the people at Yad Vashem to get a memorial marker for the people who died in the Überlingen camp. And it's quite an extraordinary story because she didn't give me any indication earlier that this was something that she was interested in, but she just thought it was not right that Überlingen did not acknowledge what had gone on there. Now we come to my heroine, the third woman in from the left. Whoops. Her name is Frau Erna Dubnak, and here she is at her sister's wedding. And Erna Dubnak came from a Polish family in Berlin, and that's her husband in the middle, sort of looking up and away, which is exactly what happened in their marriage. And they divorced later. He found someone else, she said. She was very much a blue-collar worker in many different ways, but she delivered newspapers in the pre-freezing Berlin dawn. And in 1935, when the race laws were coming about, she and her friends went to a lake in Berlin, and they saw a woman sitting on the side of the lake, and she said, "Oh, she looks so lonely." And then she said, "Oh, she looks so Jewish." And then she said, "Well, maybe she's lonely because she's Jewish. Let's invite her to be with us." So she did. And the woman became a very close friend. And in fact, when things were getting worse and worse and worse for Jews, including in Berlin, this woman, Erna Dubnak, said, "When things get really bad, whenever you want to, you come to us." And one day, the woman, Hilda Naumann, realized that the Gestapo was looking for her. And she fled to Erna Dubnak's apartment. And on the far left, that's Hilda Naumann. She housed her for over 2 years, from January 43 to the end of the war, hid her in her apartment while her little boy was there too. Her little boy knew Tante Hilda was there, but didn't know she stayed every night because Erna Dubnak didn't want him to give it away accidentally at school. And she apologized at one point that she wanted to help Hilda's cousin too, but she just didn't have enough food for two. Now, what makes this to me sort of interesting too is that everyone in the family knew what was going on. And by the way, their next door neighbors were Nazis in this apartment building. Her husband, the guy in the middle of the picture looking away, he knew his wife was hiding a Jewish woman in their apartment, and he was stationed in Denmark. And what did he do? He sent them food. So they were all very anti-Nazi, according to Frau Dubnak, and they just did what they thought was right. She said she didn't think about it too much. She simply wanted to help her friend, and she liked her very much, and she survived the war. There's a sad coda later on, which I can tell you about if you want, but just that's it for now about that. And then later, this is Frau Dubnak on the left and her sister Elsa Blisse on the right. And I took it not very well in Schloss Charlottenburg in Berlin. And she and her sister visited me and my husband, Jonathan, in our then home in Mill Valley. And she was just wonderful. She loved San Francisco, but she especially liked Haight-Ashbury because she said that she thought was the workers' quarter. So she liked that the most. And she also said that she wasn't going to tell anybody what she had done, but there was sort of an issue, an order from the mayor of Berlin saying, if you've hidden a Jewish person during the Third Reich, this was in the 80s or 70s, register. And she said, this is her quote, I didn't put such a value on it. I reported myself in the last weeks before it closed up. I thought, oh God, I registered for the sake of Berlin, really for Berlin. Bin eine Berlinerin. That Berliners were not all so bad. Finally, this is out of about, I guess it's 27 chapters in the book. This is the last chapter. This is I call the last Frau and Frauen. My friend Rita Kuhn on the left. And on the right, also a Berliner, on the right is her brother Hans. And in the middle is her cousin who was in the Hitler Youth through her mother's side. Her parents, Rita's parents, had a wonderfully romantic beginning. Her mother, who was so-called Aryan, converted to Judaism actually before meeting Rita's father. Rita's father came from a wealthy family. Rita's family had a little soap store. She was very much not high society. They fell madly in love and got married. And just as the Nazis were coming to power, Rita witnessed Crystal Night. And at one point, she had a big argument with a cousin, the guy in the middle. And she said she just remembers her mother getting very pale and saying, do not argue with him. Do not argue with him because you could be reported. So she tried not to. Meanwhile, she had to wear the star, as did her father. And her father lost his job in the bank. And they both were put to work cleaning cars coming back from the Eastern Front during the war. And she also was one of the people rounded up in a famous action called Rosenstrasse, where her mother was, where the non-Jewish wives of Jewish men were brought together in a jail, really. I'm sorry, I did it wrong. The men and the families were jailed, and it was the women, the non-Jewish women outside who protested and screamed and yelled for days and days and days. And the Nazis said they were going to machine gun them, but then they didn't. And it's one of the few known rebellions by non-Jewish women in Germany in the Third Reich. So she survived, her father survived. Hans, her brother, became a Berlin policeman after the war. And Rita eventually emigrated to the United States, got married, had 4 children, 3 surviving. And here she is in her home in Berkeley, where I first interviewed her. She is now living in Teaneck, New Jersey, where I talked to her this morning. And she became a scholar. She wrote a PhD on a medieval text. And we've become long friends. She's very much open-minded about everything. She said in her case, it was non-Jewish German women who saved her life, not only her mother, but also they had to take in a boarder who was a Nazi woman, but who cared for them and took care of them and did not denounce them, and actually took on some Russian soldiers who were about to rape her, and as a prostitute, and saved her in many ways. So her view of life is that it's very complex. And I'm just going to close with her picture by saying she rejects the assertion by some survivors that there is a Hitler in all of us because he was a systematic killer. But if one were to say there is evil in all of us, yes. She said she believes that Hitler tapped on something that's not particularly German. I mean, there's prejudice all over the world. There's fanaticism, intolerance. I mean, that is basically human nature.
Thank you so much, Alison. You can, oh, who's that?
No, that's wrong.
Okay. Why don't you stop sharing your screen so we can all see
Yes,
each other? Let's go to the top where it says stop
stop
share.
share.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank
So
you.
I have a
And
question because,
apologies.
no, please, please, we're all becoming technologically adept. Um,
We're not.
or not. I have a question though, because you started off by saying that you were hoping that the German women would, oppose the Nazi regime, and that you did not find that. However, it seemed like most of these women that you've talked about tonight were not, ardent Nazis, and had some sympathy for Jews. Maybe some of them are a little anti-Semitic, but so are these representative or not?
These are more the good guys and the bad guys, really. But Frau Fischer, the first woman who immediately talked about the idealism of National Socialism, made me rethink everything. And it took me about 4 women until I found someone who really professed to be against Nazis. So I just don't have pictures of all of them. I tend to have photographs more of the ones that I sort of liked or who were interesting or sent me their own photographs. But I'd say all in all, um, uh, I'd say it was almost equal the real horrible haters and the righteous Gentiles,
Mhm.
and a lot of other people in between. One woman I became friendly with, and I don't have her picture, named Frau Brixius. She referred to herself as a passive anti-Nazi. And I thought that was so interesting. But she said, as others have said, she just didn't know what would happen if she went against her husband, who was a very ardent Nazi, because their marriage was falling apart, and she thought he would take their children. And several of the women talked about their fear of concentration camps. Virtually all of them said they knew about concentration camps. And virtually all also said they did not know about gassing, including Traut Graber, the woman who learned that she had Jewish heritage. She said she didn't know about that until after the war. So, but I'd say overall, if I were to have photographs of all of them, it would show a more even picture, and you'd see some of the worst ones. I interviewed, by the way, a concentration camp guard, and she was among the least anti-Semitic people I interviewed, and other people who one might think would be the other way always surprised me. And a lot of people were somewhat complex in terms of their feeling and how they dealt with what they did or didn't do, I'd say. In fact, let me just tell you, the one thing that I realized afterwards was that there is guilt in post-war Germany among these women, but it's in the wrong places. Frau Dubnak, who hid her friend Hilda, feels guilty that she couldn't hide her cousin too. She just didn't have enough food. Of course, she's splitting her ration cards without getting anything in return, of course. And she said she once ate wild spinach she picked for 3 days and was very sick. But the people who were very much pro-Nazi have all, in my opinion, all found excuses to live with themselves. One woman, the worst anti-Semite, said, oh, well, she once delivered a sandwich to a Jewish family, and therefore she's just fine. She was horrible, just horrible. A lot of women from East Prussia seem to be in this certain camp of being very, very anti-Semitic. But others say, well, we were lied to, or we didn't know. And while others would say, yeah, but did you believe them after all? And there was also one element I found of fear. And that's the part that reminds me a little bit of American women then and now. What do I risk? What do I risk by defending someone online and then getting death threats, even now? What do I risk with Black Lives Matter or defending Asians, or whatever it is. What do I risk? And what are the known risks and the unknown risks? And it was those women in the middle who reminded me sort of this uncomfortable commonality.
So there are a couple of questions in the chat specifically about that first woman. And the question is, did the first woman literally use the word disappointed to describe her feelings about finding out about the camps after the war?
She really felt, I'm trying to find the quote. She felt betrayed. I don't know that I can find the exact quote. But she felt that very disappointed. I think she said she was disappointed. And she really never wanted the war in the first place. But she said,
she was disappointed that her hero would have allowed such a thing to happen.
Yeah, she was disappointed that we were also misled, because we thought that after all, everything was going to be good. And she said in a way, people won't admit it now, but there were very good years. And she said, we had happy years, we had wonderful years, and people won't admit it later, but she would. I'll tell you, I just found the quote that she said. It was when she found out what was really going on, what had really gone on. She said it was an indescribable disappointment. That was what she said. She invoked its still shimmering precedents, the tangibility of a great deal of idealism and goodwill, and commonly called sorrow, which mutual assistance required. In the spirit of the time were words like community. It was a band that embraced us all, and that suddenly ripped apart when eyes were open and saw abysses one had not known, one had not at all suspected, quite apart from the knowledge of the terrible atrocities of the Third Reich carried out, which not only shocked us, but completely demolished us.
And did that change her views about Hitler?
Yeah. Yeah, she felt not just Hitler, but she felt that they all betrayed her, because she bought hook, line, and sinker that this is going to be a wonderful community and idealistic. And
so, yeah.
And yet it's not her fault, right? They betrayed her, not that she betrayed herself.
Right. Christine? She has to unmute. There you are. No, you just muted yourself again.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Thank you for this fantastic opening to a world that some of us have thought about, but not to this degree. I wanted to ask if my parents were in Berlin as part of the Army of Occupation during the airlift. And among the women that worked for them, my mother hired everybody she could get her hands on, just because everyone was starving. So, and half the women had been raped by the Russian soldiers. So my father was appalled that she employed people who clearly were not doing any work, right? And she said, "We're getting a paycheck, Charlie, shut up." and so one of the women that worked for my mother was named Emmy, and she had been a gung-ho, pro-Nazi young woman, working class, who had been selected because of her appearance for the breeding program with the SS officers, which basically meant a free vacation to a mountain resort, and you could carry on with handsome young men, you know, I mean, really, and be considered to do something for your country. So this was her naivete. And she got pregnant, after which point she was praised and so on and so forth. Good food, good exercise, babies born, very beautiful, you know, as she put it, a perfect boy. And then what the program did was to expose these children at this particular resort to mountain air for 3 days and nights. And the ones that survived in the cold mountain air were part of the Lebensborn and adopted by good SS families and so on and so forth. Her little boy died, and that just shattered her world. And she said, they're killing people. They killed my baby. She said, what else are they doing? And so she didn't, it was like the scales lifted from the eyes. She was not a political person per se. But after that, she went back to Berlin. She was kicked out of the program, of course, because her baby was not fit. And right. And clearly, and she went back to Berlin, where her family disowned her because she was a slut. Okay, because even though this was part of the reading program, she was not seen as a good woman because she was an unwed mother. I'm wondering, did any of the women know about this that you interviewed? Any of them?
I got hints, but I didn't know enough myself to ask. So it was not on them, but on me. I read more about the Lebensborn program later, and they certainly knew that that Aryan German babies were preferred, and in fact, women could not get abortions if they wanted to.
Right.
If
Exactly.
they were Aryan, whereas Jewish women were forced to abort often, not always, but often. And the Frau Hofferkamp, the one with the 10 children, she said she knew it right away that if your parents had any kind of Nazi party affiliation, you just got better food and you got education. You got, I mean, whatever the education was, but I mean, you got to go to school, you got your school uniforms and so forth. So that was well known that if you were a Nazi kid, you did well. One of the women I interviewed, named Karma Rauhut, was very rebellious and did not go to the BDM, the Bund Deutsche Mädel, that the others happily went to, and she was punished for it. I mean, she was kind of kicked out of the school she was in. She was actually put in a quasi, not exactly a concentration camp, but sort of a penal colony for bad behaving Aryan girls.
Yeah.
And with prostitutes whom she loved. But it was well known, certainly, that if you were Aryan and perhaps even blonde, your life was a lot better than otherwise. And actually, Rita Kuhn, the last woman, she had a strange story that somebody in her father's family, so the Jewish family, was named the most beautiful woman of Germany in the early 30s, I think. And someone went up to her husband and said, "Oh, she's so beautiful. You wouldn't have thought she's Jewish." And the husband said, "What? She's Jewish?" and divorced her the next day.
Wow.
So,
Do other people have questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask
Judy,
something.
go ahead.
You know, it's interesting to me, the woman who was very good friends with the Jewish girl and loved her and also took care of her. I had a very wonderful friend who was German and who lived through the early part of the Nazis and who was in love with a Polish cousin. And the feelings between Germans and Poles were not good. So my friend,
now.
but think of what happened. But my friend Ada was punished by the German authorities because of her relationship with this cousin. So the fact that this woman was Polish would already put her in a position to not necessarily be sympathetic to the Nazis, because the feelings between Poles and Germans were not not kindly ones. Yeah. So that's just one factor, you know. And I just remember my friend telling me how she was taken away from her parents, be disciplined, because she loved someone who was Polish. So You know, all that kind of stuff went on.
Alison, I
Yeah.
have a very quick question.
Uh-huh.
Have you been back to Germany recently?
Not for, well, I was there 5 years ago, but just on a stopover.
Okay, well, because currently there is more anti-Semitism in Germany than almost any other European or any other country in the
Yeah.
world right now. And I don't know, you know, I know that it's kind of interesting because it's all over,
Yeah.
but it's a lot stronger. And I was wondering whether you had any knowledge of it.
Well, I've certainly been following it in the news, and it seemed in a way to start in East Germany because East Germany would not acknowledge that there were Nazis, that Germans were behind the Third Reich. They blamed everything on die Faschisten, on the fascists. So after the war, pretty soon after the war, from what I understand, West German schools started teaching the Holocaust.
That's right.
And there was a very well-known film series called The Holocaust. And actually,
Great supporters of Israel.
Lynn the Snob, she bought her first television just to watch it.
Hmm.
And in the East, however, there was a feeling, well, this had nothing to do with us. This was our brave Red Army soldiers rescued us, and the fascists all fled who were around here all fled to West Germany, and we are completely guiltless. So they never really dealt, in my opinion, with any kind of responsibility. And adding that to depressed industries, part of USSR system, there came time for a scapegoat, and here comes the Jewish population again. Now that might be a little simplistic, but I think that's part of it.
So let's take one more question. If okay, Jason, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious if any of the women spoke much about the reconciliation with family members and friends who had very different views as the country tried to regroup after the war. I mean, we've seen certainly in our country in the past few years, a lot of friendships and families torn apart by political difference that hasn't necessarily healed. And I'm just, there's possibly some interesting lessons in how they dealt. I mean, it's something I never really heard about, is how did the people who opposed, deal with the people who had fought for the Reich, and how did that, play out over the post-war years?
Well, my evidence is pretty scanty. What I have found is that the twain did not meet. Anti-Nazis in particular wanted to have nothing to do with Nazis. Nazis themselves kind of started keeping a low profile, or just stayed among themselves. And the biggest break I saw was, or heard about, was parents and their children. There was a woman I interviewed in Munich who I didn't show a picture of her. I guess I don't have a picture of her. She said this incredible sentence once. She said, "We did love our Führer. We really did." And I thought, okay, well, she's honest about that. And then she went on to say she cannot talk to her son-in-law about it because he doesn't understand. And they get into huge fights. And I heard about more than one family of having huge fights between generations, especially if the parents were pro-Nazi. And the children say, "How could you have done this? How could you have let this happen?" Basically. And they said, well, then they have their excuses. Well, we didn't know, or whatever it was. And that happened. And there were also a lot of broken marriages during the Third Reich, because the men came back. If they came back, defeated, and their macho was gone. And the woman had her share of taking care of everything and having her own responsibility. And then the husband comes back and wants to reassert his authority in the household. That didn't go over very well. So there were a lot of breaks on that level alone.
Okay, one last question. I think we have another couple of minutes. Anybody else?
I
have-
was curious. Yeah, hi, Rabbi.
Thanks, Ezra.
How did she meet these ladies?
Now that's a journalistic question. It started with this wonderful mentor of mine, Gordon Craig, who was a professor at Stanford University, where I had no affiliation, but he was said to be the leading German scholar. And I went down to meet with him and asked, had anyone ever interviewed these women? And he said, no. People had interviewed resistance heroines and had interviewed victims as survivors, but had not interviewed what some might call the ordinary German woman. And he started writing a list of professors. And the first was Frau Fischer, the first woman here. And because he knew her husband. And that led to a couple other professors. And that led to a few other people. And then I had a friend who moved to Germany and married a German, an American, and I interviewed her housekeeper's mother-in-law. And then I followed every lead I had, basically. I mean, it was pretty much, and this is pre-computer, of course. And I put an ad in, I guess it's the Jewish Times of San Francisco, looking for a transcriber. And it was Rita Kuhn who saw the ad, and that's how I interviewed her at the end. And a friend of mine, Renata Breidenthal, who was a big scholar on the between war era, said to me at one point, you know, you really need a rescuer. So that led about 6 steps on to finding Frau Dubnak, because she had been registered with the Berlin government for having saved somebody. So it was that sort of thing. It was just following every lead I had. At one point, I went to a town because it was well known, Rotenburg ob der Tauber. It's just a beautiful little medieval town. And I thought, I'll just see what I can find out cold. And I took a train, I got off, I went to an inn, and as I was registering at the inn, I said, oh, by the way, I'm here looking for people who might want to tell me about the Third Reich. And within an hour, I was sitting at the home of someone telling me about the Third Reich. So the short answer is various ways.
Well, Alison, thank you so very much for this great presentation. Really, as somebody mentioned in the chat, really humanizes the story.
Thank you.
Yes. And
Thank you very much.
it's wonderful to finally, meet you and get to know you a little bit.